Well, welcome everyone on this beautiful day here in Charlottesville or wherever you are. I'm Carolyn Merrick at the Center at Belvedere, a program coordinator. And today we have back with us Olga Chuchkovic, a good friend of mine and also our Roman envoy, or envoy, I guess we should say. Today we're going to take a stroll with Olga through that eternal city, but maybe places that even if you were in Rome at times exploring, you may not have seen, or if you did, known what you were looking at. So architecture of the 20th century with Olga is the topic today. Everyone is on mute. And if you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat. Olga has a lot to share with us. It'll probably take an hour, maybe a little more than an hour. And then if we have time for questions and comments at the end, we'll certainly open it up to that. So once again, thank you for attending, and I'm turning it over to Olga.
Yes, hello everyone. It's been a long time. We haven't seen each other, and I'm really happy to be here again. And this is a bit of an unusual subject because we really don't normally cover this part of Rome, these parts of Rome. There are so many, but thankfully Rome is a bottomless source of inspiration, and there's so much to see. So yes, it will be about the Roman architecture of the 20th century, but mainly concentrated of the period between the two world wars, because there is actually so much more to see from that period with respect to the later periods as far as the monumental buildings go, or peculiarities that you do not really encounter in the rest of the world. Well, many you do. Obviously, if we talk about the Rationalist architecture, it's not like it's only in Rome. It's in a whole Western hemisphere, and also partially other parts of the world. But I have tried to stick to things that are typical for Rome and still between the two world wars. And then a few things that come in the second half of the 20th century, and just a couple from the beginning of this century. They're sort of introducing us into future, whatever that future will look like. We don't know. So let's start from somewhere. This initial photo was taken in EUR, or as we call it in Italy, in Rome, EUR, which is a district in Rome that was built in the late 30s. It was in preparation for the World Fair that was supposed to take place in 1942, but the Second World War started. And while these buildings are not from before the two world wars, it's the street that's named after the architecture, Via dell'Architettura. So that's why I have chosen this as a thumbnail photo as an introduction, because we're mainly going to talk about the architecture. And you know that period is obviously very controversial, and I will absolutely not talk about any politics or anything. And there will not be any talk about art, maybe just a few hints about art in that period, which would also be worth doing a presentation on, but it's simply not enough time for all of that. So I tried to keep it to at least, you know, as far as I could, to architecture. So let's start from somewhere, and let me see my little thing. I have forgotten how these things work. So that is, let me use my finger. So this is obviously not yet between the two world wars. This is a church of the Holy Heart of Suffrage. Suffrage are the intentions, the petitions for the souls in the purgatory. And it was built in 1917. So 1917 is the period of the revival of Gothic style, and we call it neo-Gothic. So that's something that we see in, for example, in the US, there is plenty of neo-Gothic style. So this church is again from 1917. And we have in Rome also the style, this is 1901, the beautiful fountain with the so-called naiads, the water nymphs that adorns the square called Piazza della Repubblica. So I have done these little bit of introduction photos just to see what is it that we are leaving behind to enter into the period between the two world wars. The buildings that you see here on the way down to, I will point out with the cursor at the bottom in the middle, there is the view of the so-called Victor Emmanuel it's called Vittoriano, but the so-called wedding cake, the monument that we have mentioned in some of other presentations. And the name of the street is National, Nazionale. It's a lot of propaganda because it's the first modern street that was laid out in Italy after the unification, which took place in 1870. Rome becomes the capital of Italy in 1871, and all the little states that it consisted of, including the papal states, become the Kingdom of Italy. And now, as they used to say, now we have Italy, but we don't have Italians yet. So this first modern street is called Nazionale. It's the beginning of this propaganda about Italians being one nation. And at the far end is the monument that celebrates the King Victor Emmanuel. Now, these buildings were built in a style that in Rome is known as Umbertino. These buildings are Umbertine. What's Umberto? What is it? Umberto was the King of Italy, the second King of Italy. And since these buildings were built during his rule, and it's a bit of a neo-historical, neo-Baroque, neo-Renaissance, so sort of look older than what they really are, but they're at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. And in Rome, we call them Umbertine, from the King Umberto. Now, this is the gallery, National Gallery of Modern Art. So this project goes back to early 1900s and 1911, where there was the Universal Exposition, which celebrated the unification of Italy. And we're heading towards more modern styles, but more inside, but still with the columns, the Corinthian capitals, that recall the classical past. That's an amazing gallery. I would like to be able one day to do a presentation on it, but I have to still, as we say, where I come from, warm up my chair for that. There's a lot to study. It has 20,000 works of art of the 1900s. So really an extraordinary gallery and extraordinary space as well. So early 1900s. And there is a very whimsical district in Rome that is named after the architect whose name was Coppede, Gino Coppede. This is the project that was started in 1915 and completed in 1927. Gino Coppede was this whimsical architect who is sometimes cannot be compared with, but as an idea of a peculiar style and very personal, it may recall Gaudí of his own time. And liberty, yes, no, that's the period, but Gino Coppede was unique. And this little, it's literally, again, it's called the district Coppede. Coppede was his last name, but it's actually just one little crossroad with these beautiful buildings at the corner with peculiar invented little monsters. This is a building known as Casa Ragno. Ragno is the spider. You see here behind this mask, there is a lovely little spider. And there are some really extraordinary gates like this one. And the fountain of the frogs. You see there are little frogs here at the top and little Liberty, a villa behind it. Actually in Rome, these small villas have a name, which is villini. Villini, little villas, they became the obsession of the 1920s and 30s. And a lot of the public housing projects were also made in the form of villini, not necessarily buildings with a lot of apartments. There's that as well. We'll talk about that as well. But this is an example of a neighborhood that's called San Saba. There is a medieval monastery there where throughout the Middle Ages, only the monastery was on this little hill. And San Saba is within what we call in Rome the Aurelian walls. You may recall, if you were there for other presentations on Rome, there is this 3rd century wall with a diameter of 13 miles. And everything that's within the Aurelian wall could be compared with a sort of Manhattan of Rome. And the price of the real estate is much higher if you are within the wall. The minute you cross the wall, the price drops. Unless you are north, that's where the more elegant parts of Rome are. And generally in Europe, elegant suburbs are in the northern part of the city, because in the past, poor people were using all kinds of things that did not smell very nicely. For example, the glass blowers, the blacksmiths, a lot of fires, a lot of smoke. In ancient Rome, they used urine for bleaching of the stains in the laundries. And people in elegant suburbs didn't want that smell under their, nose or the window. So they would build their districts in the northern parts of the cities, because the winds that clean the air, they blow from the north. And that's why the elegant suburbs like Parioli, which we're going to name towards the end of the presentation, is in the north. Although it's outside of the Aurelian Wall, it's really expensive. But back to San Saba, this was built again in the 1921. Let's say that's the period. Of course, it took a few years. And these little villini are now worth a fortune because they are in the right neighborhood. They're what we call in Rome bifamiliari, so two families in one villa with the garden. The gardens, these villini, small villas, all had little gardens around them, and you can see plenty of them, but you also, of course, have to go outside of the busy center of Rome. And these were not for very poor people. These were residential blocks built basically between 1907, 1914 for the working middle class, like they would say for petit bourgeois. And now they are putting them on auctions, but the people are complaining because that was public housing. But before the changes in society and all that, these people living within the Aurelian walls usually had a higher level of education, and throughout the generations, they managed to earn some more money than the grandfather, and they were able to buy these apartments from the government. When they put these in auction, a lot of other families who otherwise would have the right to buy them for a reduced price, they cannot afford that. So there's a lot of speculations about this public housing if it's in the neighborhood that was gentrified. Now, this is also the neighborhood that was gentrified. This is an example of a building from 1915, and this is a public housing for the workers of the railways all over Rome. There are huge condominiums for the workers of the railways. There are still in Italy, railways are an institution, have been an institution for a really long time. I'm talking about more than a century. And there are a lot of people who work for the railways. But these apartments, there are 120 in this condominium. They're no longer, this is the courtyard. Inside, there's always a courtyard inside. They're no longer, most of them do not really work for the railways because they bought these from the state, and then the subsequent generations sold it to whoever they want. So there's like a mixed reality. Condominiums like these were used frequently for the Italian neo-realistic movies to show, like this is say middle class workers of the railways. But apart from that public housing now, we are looking at a very, again, whimsical building that was built around 1920. And it was a new district where they had to expropriate some land, namely from the wealthy family Torlonia. We had a presentation on them, but also other families, because there was a project which was never realized about a navigable canal that would have like a little river port that would come from the Tyrrhenian Sea. That's about 20 miles away. And it was never realized, but this neighborhood is now called Garbatella, and it became a public housing neighborhood. But it was started in the 1920 in this style that is known as Barrocchetto. Barrocchetto, it may ring some bells like it's Baroque. Well, Barrocchetto was a sort of a funny, whimsical little Baroque style already in the 1700s. But to distinguish this from the historical Barrocchetto, so the Baroque, this one is called Barrocchetto Romano, Roman Barrocchetto. And you can see that around Rome in many neighborhoods. in this same, you see, if you went through this gate, for example, you would enter into beautiful alley with gardens and little homes. But I wanted to show you something different. Now, this doesn't look very fancy, and it's not. There were these, and now it's changing. Some of these buildings are being, again, gentrified. But this is a so-called suburban hotel, albergo. These were the huge public housing projects where people had shared spaces, like not just kindergartens, but also, and schools, but also kitchens, and the facilities were frequently in common. They were really for the poor, and still a lot of families there. There were people who used to live in the sheds, the immigrants, not international immigrants at that point, immigrants from Italy who were coming to Rome because it seemed like there was work to do in 1920s and 30s. A lot of people who lost their homes. And there was a lot of anti-fascists that the communists who were hiding in these hotels, they call them, suburban hotels. This one is very famous, Albergo Rosso, the red hotel. And now my friend's daughter, you know, she bought, well, her dad, lucky girl, he bought an apartment here for her. And these places now, of course, you know, they have been restored and it's no longer facilities in common. But there is this sense of community in these buildings. I've been around the neighborhoods that I'm showing you, couldn't go to all of them, there's so many. But this one, like all those houses of the condominiums of the railway workers, there's always this sense of community where people interact, they have little events together, and they gravitate towards each other. This spirit of sharing is something that disappears with modern architecture later. And once we entered this building, this was, you see, it was Christmas, and see how people had little rooms, and they would all come out on this spiral hall. And then somebody told us to go away because just a few of us entered to see. And then, who are you? Well, we're just, you know, we're just curious. They were not very happy about that, but we were very, very quiet. And as I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of the communists, and communists organized the resistance movement, and they were hiding in these albergues. So there were always these police nearby to keep them under control. And also they would close a lot of anti-fascists during the, for example, Hitler's visit to Rome in 1938. A lot of these people were held here as a sort of like a prison, temporary prison, just not to cause trouble. And at that time, in the 1920s, now Mussolini came into power as a prime minister in 1922. He marched on Rome with his supporters, and then he started leaving marks everywhere. When something was built during the regime, frequently, like this little villino, it would have this mark. This is 1931. And then you see something on the right, which you don't see anywhere else. It's number 9, all right, but EF, era fascista, of the fascist era. Because again, he marched on Rome 1922, and in the 9th year of his era, he built that during his regime. And this is something similar to what the popes used to do. If you go around Rome and you look at the papal palaces, museums, buildings, churches, frequently you see the mark, the name of the Pope, and then Pontifex Maximus, like supreme priest, and then some year, anno, year, and then 1665. That would refer to the year of his papacy, which you know only if you know. If you don't, it's a kind of a puzzle. So you'll see plenty of that. This is another example of this beautiful little villino that would have been built for, let's say, poorer, but still people who were employed. So really poor, I'll show you where they ended up. Or there were these villini in these eclectic style, like fake Middle Ages. This is 1929, so this is on the most elegant hill in Rome called Aventino. This is our Beverly Hills today, the most exclusive residential part of Rome. And back to that condominium of the railway workers. You see, it's that one, the yellow one on the right, but to the left, there is another building that looks different. It was built in 1926. This is public housing, but also for the workers of some government institution. And as all these buildings, it has an inner courtyard. Inner courtyards were all the rage in those years. And I love this one, a circular, like oval. I entered in so many of these buildings because I guess I don't look dangerous. So people would just open the gate and let me in. And then I took pictures. This is the part of the so-called Garden City project, which was based on the British ideas of urbanistic planning, like their model actually. And then there were a lot of schools. This is, again, this now a little bit of historical, but we're heading towards rationalism. And talking about rationalism, this post office is a great example of rationalist architecture. Mussolini was crazy about post offices, railway stations. So we don't really have, our railway station in Rome was built in the 1950s. It was planned in the there was an older one, obviously, in the late 1800s, but knocked down. So it's not from that period. But this is actually a great example. Whoever likes rationalist architecture, which is free of any frills, would like this post office. And there is another one in Piazza Bologna, which is also, I believe, I just happen to like it. This little curve and marble entrance. It is so elegant and quintessential. Just, okay, windows, that's what we need. And let's be very rational about it, because that was a style that was like Le Corbusier. It was fashionable all over Europe and in US as well, obviously. And an important architect of that period was Moretti. And this is his Casa delle Armi. So this is part of the sports complex that was built in Rome under Mussolini. Sports were one of the most important parts of the propaganda in the fascist era. So always celebrating these healthy bodies. You know, it's very similar to what Hitler was doing as well. The art followed that same concept. And now this is also Moretti. This was the building that was the center where the young people would gather, but certain kind of young people. They were called Balilla, and they were like paramilitary, 18 to 14 years old. And this building is turned into a museum. There are exhibitions, it's for exhibition hall, in its perfect example of the rationalist style, 1933. Inside, this was a temporary exhibition of the photographs, but you see what's on the wall, and they did not take it down. It mentions, Mussolini and the conquests. Mussolini dragged Italy into colonial wars. So here you see Libya, Ethiopia. I'm pointing here in Africa, the parts of Africa that he ventured into. That's when he lost all the international support that he may have had before. And now let's not go into that. But that is the part of history, and it's inside this former center for paramilitary youth of the fascism. And these projects were carried out all over Italy, hundreds. Mussolini made about 320 visits to all these construction sites, schools, post offices, you name it. And I'll just have brought here one video I made in Naples recently, just to show you. This is Questura, the police, and the Central Province District Office, and the post office. So this was typical for so many Italian towns. So again, this is in Naples. And okay, Questura. And then let's go back to Rome, where you see the famous Piazza Venezia. And again, to the left, there's the wedding cake monument, or Vittoriano, with the King, Victor Emmanuel. The monument was inaugurated in 1905. Remember, nobody ever lived there. It was just a monument. There is a museum there dedicated to the unification of Italy. Locals never liked it, too ostentatious. They didn't like the royal family, and that's why they rebranded it very successfully as the tomb of an unknown soldier. So poor unknown soldier is buried in that monument, and it symbolizes the altar of the homeland, the symbol of the unification. And it was a great backdrop for Mussolini's speeches, which he held from this balcony here in the middle of the brown building with the flags. That's a museum, Palazzo Venezia. The building is 500 years old, and it became his office. So those famous or infamous speeches, he held them from that balcony and this altar of the homeland. Italy lost 600,000 people in the First World War, was a great propaganda backdrop for his speeches. And between the wedding cake and the Colosseum, there's an area that is now totally empty. You see, now we are behind the Vittoriano, empty, empty, empty. Then an ancient wall that divides the neighborhood Monti from what used to be the Roman Forum, some medieval fortress, tower, then some older buildings, again, big empty space, Colosseum, the Basilica of Constantine. So empty space in a modern city, in an old city, sorry, is not logical. So there was a huge amount of people's dwellings, the condominiums that were built on top of ancient Roman, on top of the farms, after all ancient Roman layer was scavenged or ruined or lost. Then these buildings, and I'll show you, this is a photo which I found not copyrighted, so public domain, it's not good, but it gives you an idea. So this is now in the very middle, all that is missing. Now, not this church, the church is still there. So this part here, Mussolini transformed into that boulevard for his military parades, especially to impress Hitler in 1938. And a lot of these people were assigned public housing far away because they were really, really poor people who lived there. And another project that was started in the 30s and completed in the 50s. You see this big wide street between the St. Peter's Basilica, the Vatican, and the river of Tiber. So start from the Basilica and then follow the cursor to the river. This is how it looked like. But this was another project, a modernization, started in the 1930s, actually carried out in the 50s. This is what we have today. And the street is called Via della Conciliazione, the reconciliation. Between whom? Between the Pope and the King. Because due to the kingdom, Pope remained without his state, without his kingdom, basically. And he was officially recognized as a king in Europe at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. But remained without that state, which was stretched between Tyrrhenian Sea and Adriatic, practically cutting Italy in two halves. And Vatican City-State, the smallest state in the world, was given to the Pope by Mussolini in 1929. So it was about time that the Pope and the King make peace. So that was Via della Conciliazione. Now, another Umbertina. I just wanted to show you what was the style again of turn of the century. This building is 100 years old. It's the Court of Cassation, the Supreme Court. And right next to it, for example, this is behind, you can see an Institute of National Association for the War Invalids in Rome. And next to it, you see the difference between what it used to be and what the new period is bringing, 1920s and 30s, the bricks and travertine. Here in the backdrop is the Greco-Roman classicism adapted to modern, like the neo-1500s Ministry of Internal Affairs, built around between 1911 and 1925. But in front of it, we see the fascist rationalist fountain with the good old she-wolf, the symbol of Rome, the one who raised Romulus and Remus. She's all over because it was an ancient Roman symbol, and Mussolini wanted to stress the connection between the empire and himself. He wanted to be thought about as a new emperor, new Augustus. And the offices all over the place in this rationalist style. This is the theater of opera that was started in the 1930s, but completed in the 1960 by the architect of the regime. His name was Marcello Piacentini, and he was responsible for so much of that, let's say, getting away or going beyond rationalism, going towards monumentalism. So when Mussolini stopped identifying himself, rationalism did not provide for political identification. It was too international, too modern, everybody did it. We needed something that had more of a Roman expression, and we'll get to that. So the architect who did the opera, again, Marcello Piacentini, he lived much after the period of the regime, and he completed the theater. This is a typical turn of the 1920s to 30s, so 28 to 32, also Piacentini. The ministry of the so-called corporations, now of the economical development. You see them, the flags of the European Community and Italy. This ministry, I've never been inside, I just managed to enter to where there's the porter, because they organize guided tours of that ministry on very rare dates, which I never managed to somehow fit in my schedule, but it has extraordinary works of art inside. They spent 32 million back then, lira, on the building, and about 1 million just on art. Maraini, Sironi was also connected with the regime, not necessarily fascist himself, but working in that era. Now this is 1937, the Museum of the Carabinieri. Carabinieri are the military police. So you'll see on the streets of Rome, both Carabinieri. They were founded in the 1800s in the Kingdom of Italy, and they continue as Carabinieri to this day. Then the insurance companies, INA, again, pure rationalism. And wherever you see these slogans in Latin, something we built, we celebrated, and we are the emperor, we are the empire, that is fascist. Very typical. Just look for some big Latin. And this is actually really gorgeous building. It's so-called Dopo Lavoro. Dopo Lavoro was a typical fascist thing, to build these facilities where people could gather after work. And this is still Dopo Lavoro of the people working for the railways. They organize a bunch of cultural activities, trips. It's kind of the guided visits, the trips all over Italy. They're still actually very active. And back to the railways. This is just, it's a jewel. 1929, in one of those faraway suburbs. Now, I mentioned those that were close, the public housing for the people who worked for the government in different institutions. And this is, again, the railways. It's far away from the center. It's in the suburbs, far away from the historical center. But it's extraordinary architecture, but it was near some of the railroads and the smaller railway stations. So that is why. And Mussolini founded 12 borgate. If you look at the map of Rome, so historical Rome, and then all over, mainly in the south, southeast, and also southwest, there are these neighborhoods that were meant for the poorest of the poorest. Just get away with them. I mean, get them away from the site. And a lot of migrants. But this is really popular and beautiful building that now is really, if you wanted to live there, it would cost you. And it's called of the deers. You know, there are these deers, their antlers are missing. There are little anecdotes about that, but let's not go into too many stories. And I went inside. So this is like a circular courtyard. And in the middle is the fountain with who else? The she-wolf. There she is, the ancient Roman she-wolf with the pigeons, quite a few pigeons gathering around the she-wolf. And this is the bridge that was started in 1938, but damaged in the Second World War and completed in 1950. It has typical fascist eagles, the symbol of the fascist military. Although eagle is an ancient symbol, a lot of papal coats of arms have eagles. Eagles are a lot of generally coats of arms. Ancient Romans used eagle as their symbol, and that's why Mussolini adopted it. And again, the she-wolf, you can't avoid her. There she is. And now this is the example of a ministry, typical architecture for the ministries of that period, late 1800s, early 1900s, but this is quite late. This is Ministry of Public Education, built between 1916 and 1926. There was already a very strong Italian movement for rational architecture. So it was defined as a horror of Umbertine, remember Umberto, provincial and folkloristic Italy, because it was so far away from international avant-garde. So that's what the architects thought. The building was actually quite lovely. And so this is a religious building of the period of the 1930s. And it's the so-called eclectic style, which picks up a bit of historical styles from all over. This was built by the congregation of Our Lady of Charity, of the Good Shepherd. That's a long name. It's enormous. It consists of like a cluster of buildings. It's like the celestial city of Jerusalem. And it's using also the symbols of the papacy. But for example, this coat of arms is of the Pope Kiji, Alexander VII, who lived in the 1600s. So it has nothing to do with the current building, but that's what the eclectic style is about. You pick up a little bit of this and that of the historical styles and transform them into this modern building of that time, 1930. So started 1929, but then 1933 and inaugurated in the early 40s. The Vatican was also, with its extraterritorial properties, following the dictate of the style of that time, monumental with the mixture of rationalist, so modern, but with Roman touch to it. So always trying to come up with something that would be typically Roman or Italian. And this architect, his name was Momo. He designed this extraterritorial, it's in the Trastevere neighborhood. It's not in the Vatican City State, and there are a lot of different offices inside. The same architect designed in 1932 this incredible double spiral staircase that those of you who have been to the Vatican museums know about. One ramp was used to enter, the other one to leave the Vatican museums once when they became a public museum and no longer a private collection of the popes. And now that I show you something, it may ring some bells, like Peggy Guggenheim. Frank Lloyd Wright was in Rome, and he was inspired by the staircase for his Peggy Guggenheim. See the Art Deco glass at the top. So here is another square of the 1930s with a building for the offices and the church that was completed in the 1950s. But this is the name of the Pope, Pius IX. PM stands for Pontifex Maximus. He's the Pope who signed the Lateran Treaty with Mussolini for the Vatican City, the formation of the Vatican City State. And this is another example of this little barrocchetto Romano, so Roman little Baroque. This is public housing. There's a gorgeous garden inside of this building. It's a whole block. And then you enter through the gate and there are all these gardens and fountains. This is now really expensive. It's not within the wall, but it's very close to the cathedral and it's very well connected with the center of the city. So it's expensive. But talking about Baroque, there's also this beautiful example of neo-Baroque. And this was built for in the 1930s for the workers of higher echelons of the government. But I saw recently there's an apartment on sale. So if you have $1 million to spare, we could invest, but it's extraordinary. It's right on the river of Tiber. So that's the example of a neo-Baroque. So talking about the architecture in between the two world wars. And there were beautiful buildings that were also financed by private people in this neo-Baroque style for their own dwellings. And back to the public housing, in 1932, there was this new proletariat that was forming, these people who migrated towards Rome. So this is slightly out. Now it's quite central, relatively. You know, in a big city like Rome, it's difficult to say what's central. Let's say this is Brooklyn with respect to Manhattan. And the building to the right, sorry, let's just go back. The building to the right, the brown one, is Barocchetto. And the yellow one to the left has been recently restored. And this was built by the institute called ICP, Istituto Case Popolari, which was the Institute for Public Housing, the fascist authority. And inside, this is again typical for these homes that they have different courtyards, plenty of apartments. Frequently, the apartments share the same balustrade to enter. But this building had a lot of problems, but it was recently restored and gentrified, and the price is rising. And it has this peculiar shape of U, the balconies, that actually aerial view, and that wasn't the only place where Mussolini did that. It says Dux, D-U-X, Il Duce, the Duke, and that was his nickname. And when I was looking for an apartment and informing myself about stuff, I was looking at these places. They were so charming to me. And then somebody told me, don't think about it, because there are so many complicated ownership issues between the institute from the past. Now, who are the heirs? Are they selling it legal? So forget about it. But they're architecturally, I believe, really interesting. This is another example typical of the public housing 1930s. This was for the civil servants, again, public housing, 1938. And this is for Trullo. But now Trullo is becoming gentrified, and it has beautiful murals all over, but real artists, not stupid graffiti. And you see how these people, you know, they shared the same balcony for entrance, like these American motels. I believe they have something similar like that from the movies, from the horror movies. But I don't see that in Europe so much. And this is one of those courtyards. And here's a graffiti that I like very much, the mural actually, Frida Kahlo. This other lady is Gabriella Ferri. She was a very popular singer in the 80s. 70s, 80s. And this is where, let's say, marginalized people still live. But I went there for my little inspection trip, and let's go back there with Frida. And I really loved it. It was Sunday morning, and I went to a little cafe to have a cappuccino, took myriads of photos. And there was these local people who came to have a cappuccino, coffee, and a little croissant or something for breakfast. It was their little Sunday ritual. And there was a little old lady who said, hello, which cake do you like? And then another one, I sat outside because I just loved what I was looking at. And she was like worried, are you cold? Are you really cold outside? You feel that these people, you know, somehow still care about each other. They may not have much, but they do. Now, this is another, at least most of them are those that I met. Tufello, you see, this doesn't look that fancy, and it's not. Maybe some of these homes that have access to gardens will eventually be more gentrified again and become more expensive. But this whole neighborhood, it's enormous, this Tufello. It has this huge graffiti, Tufello antifascista. So we are anti-fascist, because Mussolini, when the Second World War started, he had Italian migrants return from France. He forced them to return. And these people hated the regime, hated the fascism. So there is very strong spirit, right? There are neighborhoods in Rome where locals would tell you, oh, this is molto fascista. Then there are other neighborhoods, oh, this is very antifascista. So there's still, I cannot say that they really tackled this part of their past. But I wanted to show you this antifascista Tufello. I for some time lived near this neighborhood in a new home with some friends, but this is called San Basilio. And the sheds that were built for the poor by the regime in the 30s were replaced by these public housing houses in the 1950s. There are about 4,000 in this neighborhood. These are really marginalized people. There's also some crime and drugs and stuff. And altogether, there are about 77,000 homes for people who need help in Rome. It's about 6% of the total housing in Rome. This is again Quarticciolo, another one of those public housing projects outside or far away from the city center. See how people hang out, the laundry, and some have really interesting architecture like these arches, but still marginalized. And a lot of people after the Second World War ended up without homes, and plenty of them were living in the aqueducts. You see here that this is outside, very far away from the center. You can see the traces of the plaster, of the paint on people's homes. A lot of Pasolini's movies were filmed in these little homes that were removed in the 70s. And these people were assigned these public housing homes, 70s and 80s. And some really don't look that good because they're still looking for solutions. But on the more monumental side, there's Foro Italico, the forum, the sports halls. You see the big stadium here in the backdrop, the obelisk that actually has Mussolini's name still on it. And it was called Foro Mussolini, but it's now called Foro Italico. And it was completed in 1950s for the Olympic Games that took place in Rome in 1960. There's a beautiful, beautiful swimming pool, and also other, of course, facilities, stadiums, gyms, halls. But I was there a few years ago, and I was lucky somehow, not going to tell you the whole story how I managed, but with a friend, the guy opened the door for us and he took us around, and we went to the Mussolini's private gym, where there's this gorgeous staircase and the mosaics, and then his private little, I didn't take pictures of that back then. This is 5 years ago. Who knew I would be doing any presentations on anything? But the little studio apartment that he used, and then he had his own gym. He really cared about showing himself like a big, strong man. And there's plenty of fascist art, which I'm just going to touch very briefly, like this athlete. This is 1930s. He's holding a strigil. Strigil was used by the ancient Roman and Greek athletes to clean themselves. And it recalls ancient Roman. This is a Hellenistic prince, Greco-Roman. Or Hercules. This one is in Naples, but this is a typical representation. This is ancient, of Hercules, inspired Michelangelo. And it was the inspiration for a lot of fascist art. Now, this is a gorgeous stadium called Stadio dei Marmi, the Stadium of the Marbles or marble statues. This is all that sports center. And these statues, there are 60. They were all donated by the province are the districts in Italy. There are 60 provinces, like Rome is a province, Naples is a province, Siena, Florence. And they donated a statue each. And in the backdrop, you see that very rationalist building. That's the Ministry of External Affairs called Farnesina. Now, another project that Mussolini built in 1930s now. This is very rationalist. This is the so-called La Sapienza. And this is again Marcello Piacentini. This is the university center, which is one of the best universities. It's not the best internationally, definitely in Europe for classical sciences, especially archaeology. We are where we are. And there's plenty of really incredible architecture and art. This is Mario Sironi with his fresco that was many elements that were clearly very fascist were covered for a long time. And now it's been restored and it's there. Mario Sironi is a part of the culture of that period. And this fresco recalls the School of Athens by Raphael in the Vatican Museum. So always the ideal connection with the myths of antiquity and the connection between art and architecture, which is insoluble. There's some really great pieces inside the whole La Sapienza, so the University of Rome. We don't have campuses, students don't live here. And in the middle, there is a statue of Minerva, because it was all meant to resemble the ancient agora or forum, agora for the Greeks, forum for the Romans. So the statue of Minerva by Arturo Martini. There is a little superstition among the students, don't never ever look her in the eye before the exam. And the math, it's quite surreal, metaphysical. Gio Ponti, the famous architect, designed the faculty of mathematics. And inside I went on a guided tour. This was a library in the faculty of math. It's extraordinary. And how did Mussolini, connect this whole myth of his personality with Augustus? There was a lot of work on that. And you see on this photo, it says here at the bottom to the right, Ara Pacis Augustae. So the altar of the peace of Emperor Augustus. Emperor Augustus built a big altar to celebrate the end of the civil wars. And it wasn't here where you see it today. It was about 1,000 feet farther from that site. It was extracted from the foundations of a building, recomposed on this site. And the shell that you're looking at inside is the altar. The shell was designed by Richard Mayer, who won the competition internationally between the architects. And then you see in the far away, there are the buildings that surround the square, which were built by the fascist regime. These are the local INPS, which is the Providential for Social Security Retirement Funds institution. But there's something behind these cypress trees. That is what he really wanted. This is the altar, which is now inside this shell designed by Richard Mayer, which replaced the old one. Mussolini's architecture, and it's all connected with the mausoleum of Augustus, the first Roman emperor who was buried here 2,000 years ago. And the fascist regime removed a huge cluster of homes that grew on top like fungus on these ancient monuments, and rebuilt, actually restored to the site the mausoleum of the emperor, together with the altar of peace, and then with the fascist architecture. It was all meant to impress Hitler, who was coming to visit in 1938. Now, when Mussolini realized that the rationalism was not really expressing his regime enough, it was too modern, he thought of this universal Esposizione Universale, basically the World Fair, to take place in 1942, so 20 years since he came into power. It never took place because of the Second World War. There were this huge cluster of buildings that was built in the open countryside. Now this is this neighborhood called EUR. And this is the most famous of the buildings. Again, Marcello Piacentini was chosen for his essential classicism, inspired by classical Roman, again, ancient Roman urban planning. This building is larger than life. I'm glad that there is a car there and the little person behind the fence, so that you can get the sense for the size. They call it the Square Colosseum, and it is currently housing the headquarters of the fashion brand Fendi. But it was meant to be the part of this world fair. And this is a video just to show you how that neighborhood looks like. This is insurance companies, center for the congresses, conventions, columns, obelisk, obviously, as ancient Romans. This is really typical for that time. Now there's a huge residential area around it today, but this is just the very center of it. And again, the obelisk, which I wanted to show you because of course it stands straight. This is like a fisheye photograph, but it recalls obviously what Romans used to do, but this is not really Romans. The obelisk is ancient Roman, but not Egyptian, but ancient Roman. And it's in the middle of the Quirinale square in front of the presidential palace. And the Pope Sixtus V, actually, because originally this palazzo was built by the popes. And he wanted to have these obelisks that were found in the foundations of the buildings and all over Rome, brought from Egypt and some made by Romans. He used them as focal points, and some of them, you may recall, the churches and pilgrimage as GPS for the pilgrims. In this case, it's like a focal point of this square. something similar, St. Peter's Square, again, obelisk, columns. So wherever you go in that monumentalist architecture, that's what you see, the obelisks, the columns, the pillars. This is Convention Center, Palazzo dei Congressi, with, of course, columns. With this very clear-cut architecture inside and mosaics, because that was ancient Roman thing. And in front of what was supposed to be the ticket office, there's a fountain and mosaics, which represent the scenes from mythology, celebrating the work, the sports. And inside, this would have been the entrance to the cashiers to buy the tickets for the World Fair. And there is some absolute, I mean, I like it. What can I say? I like this architecture. This bench here at the bottom to the right appeared in the movie Great Beauty, that won Oscar in the category of, it's a strange movie, but it's purely just to watch the beauty of Rome. And the main actor is sitting importantly on this bench. And this is one of the gates to what is today the Museum of Roman Civilization, ancient Roman civilization, that has been under restoration forever. So we can't wait in Rome really for it to open, because it has some extraordinary pieces, including, most importantly, it says Museo della Civiltà, that's what it says at the architrave. It has a huge model of ancient Rome that is the greatest thing to study about how ancient Rome looked like. And again, at just a second, now the mosaics, it's always very political. Nothing is random. For example, here you see a lovely lady throwing flowers, and it may seem, well, lovely enough, random, but what is really happening, it's Flora, the goddess, who's giving flowers to Juno, who cannot have children with Zeus, with Jupiter. But after Flora gave her flowers, Juno gives birth to God Mars. Who's God Mars? The god of the war, who's then the father of Romulus and Remus with a Vestal Virgin. So there's behind everything, there's a lot of politics and propaganda. Of course, Romulus and Remus and the she-wolf, who looks more like a cow, sort of, but you can sort of tell, well, that it's a she-wolf, just because we see the twins, we know right away. And this is an example of ancient Roman mosaic. There is this extraordinary museum called Centrale Monte Martini. It's a hydroelectric, not hydroelectric, it's electric plant that was turned into a museum, like archaeological, industrial archaeology. And I would love to take you there one day. And this is from that museum, but shows you the ancient museums, the ancient mosaics. And then there is this relief. Mussolini used reliefs a lot because, again, ancient Romans, the column of Trajan from the 2nd century, telling us the story about Emperor Trajan conquering nowadays Romania, crossing Danube. And the whole story is like a little Instagram on this column, 2,500 people carved in little actions. And the mosaic, the relief here at Eur starts with, you see at the top on the left, again, the twins and the she-wolf, then the columns and the fighting and the emperors and the temples, you know, all these huge things. And then here is the menorah that was brought from Jerusalem when Titus destroyed the Solomon's temple, the Colosseum, the column of Trajan. Then in the middle, you see St. Peter's Basilica with the obelisk that's being repositioned. That's a historical fact. And what do we end up with? Mussolini on the horse. So more propaganda than this is very difficult to find. Now, the rationalist architecture in that neighborhood continues, but this is the state archive that was completed in the 50s. The 50s carry on with rationalism. They imitate a lot the rationalism from the 1920s and 30s. And in the same neighborhood, you can see this from far away. Like, what's that dome? Well, that was supposed to be the mausoleum of Mussolini. He was supposed to be buried there. but it was never completed. And you see how much construction there is still going on in EUR and EUR. EUR stands for Esposizione Universale Romana, which is basically the Roman World Fair. And this building was completed in 1950s, and it's a church dedicated to Peter and Paul. So these are basically like the statues of Peter and Paul that you see in front of the St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. Peter holding the keys here to the left, and because he gave the keys to Jesus, and Paul holding a sword because he was beheaded. So it's a church now, but it was supposed to be the mausoleum of Mussolini. And there are many smaller interventions that you can see all over. Like, for example, this is an ancient theater, not an amphitheater, but just a theater, so half circle. And it was built in the 1st century, then started in the BC, finished in the 1st AD, and called Teatro Marcello. Marcello was the son-in-law of Emperor Augustus. And at the top, there are the walls of the 13th century medieval fortress, but there were some apartments there already, but they were extended and some other structures were added. But before you add structures, you have to make sure that your building is stable. So to the right, here when I'm pointing, there are these yellowish arches. They were added to Teatro Marcello. And here to the left, you can see this fake Middle Ages, but I was trying to draw your attention to this triangular support that reinforce the structure, and then you can add a few more things. And it's got this symbol of the bundle of rods with an axe that becomes the symbol of fascism. It's a same intervention. I'll get back to the axe and the bundle of rods. The same system. You see, this is how the popes reinforced the Colosseum 200 years ago to prevent the crumbling away of the arches. So see how there was this intention to always imitate ancient Roman. But the bundle of rods, this is an abandoned water tower from the 6th year of fascism, so 1928. You see AN stands for a year, anno, like annually, think of annually, anno. And then number 6, SPQR stands for the Senate and People of Rome. So that's the water tower, so it's a public intervention. And it's in a bad shape. But the bundle of rods with an axe was the symbol of the so-called lictors. Lictors walked in front of the magistrates in ancient Rome, carrying the bundle of rods with an axe. This is from a church in the 1600s. In US, I read in the 1920s, there were the bundle of rods with an axe on a nickel dime. And I don't know exactly which, but I know that there was, not anymore, because the fascism takes that as their symbol, and the bundle in Italian is il fascio. So fascism, fascio, the bundle of rods, because they wanted, again, to be as just as the Roman magistrates. And little interventions, again, here in Piazza Navona, where you would never expect an intervention from that period, but around this fountain that was designed by Bernini as well, not just the central one of the 4 rivers, there's this fence with little pillars with the fascist eagle and the bundle of rods, and EF at the bottom to the right, SPQR, Senate and People of Rome, and Era Fascista. Also in Piazza Navona, there's this portico that was added to the building in the 1930s. And whenever you build something or intervene or dig or do around Piazza Navona, you run into the remains of the ancient Roman stadium built by Emperor Domitian. And here we see what happened. The pillar of the stadium of Domitian, scoperto, discovered in April 1933, MCM, and then 3 times 10 and then 3, 19. But what's this below? Again, the year 11 of fascist era. Somebody scraped it away. An uncomfortable reminder of the past. Now, this obsession with monumentalism and ancient Roman proportions continues into the 50s. For example, this is a church of the Holy Heart of Mary. Again, 1950s. It was supposed to have the dome as well, but it was never finished, so it would have resembled the Pantheon much more than it already does. And that's, again, the intention, to always go back to these perfect proportions and keep this Romanita, the being Roman in the architecture as well. The villini, the little villas, become palazzetti. Palazzetti are, according to new regulation plans of urban planning in Rome, these palazzetti can be this tall, this large, depending on the neighborhood, but this is a beautiful neighborhood, Parioli. I have remained here now in this very expensive, remember, north of the Gates neighborhood. And here, for example, there's a street with these fancy condominium buildings, a lot of offices. I used to work here in the law firm for 5 years, and it's really extraordinary, just unaffordable to go live there. But due to a lot of urbanistic and construction speculations after the Second World War, everybody wanted to be in Parioli. They built these buildings too close. There's no room for the cars. It has become quite too busy, basically too busy. But there are a lot of beautiful villini and palazzetti. So if you can afford a garage, which to us is like Aladdin's lamp, the ghost, then it's okay to live in Parioli. Or as I was taking the tram, the trolley, so I didn't care, didn't even have a car. But what I really wanted to show you here, remember that architect Moretti, who did those square rationalist buildings, then this is 1950, he's still there, and he designed this house, little apartment building. Actually, there are more offices there. When I looked at the doorbell, there are more offices than apartments. And it's called girasole, or the sunflower, because it's kind of turned towards the sun, and it always has light. You see how it's broken into two parts here in the middle, vertically. So the sun and the light always enters. Of course, it doesn't revolve, but it's as if it were revolving. Then 1950s and 60s, they saw a huge construction enthusiasm, but mainly for apartment buildings outside of the city center. And they were built usually by construction companies, and then apartments were sold to people. Public housing continues, obviously, even to this day. And not building new public housing anymore, but until 1980s, more or less. And people are assigned these homes based on graduatoria, it's called. You have to present your income or luck thereof, and then the government provides. Frequently, they give these apartments for much lower rents than what they would normally be. And then in the past, it happened like that. After several decades or so, you can buy for a convenient price. And then 1970s, this is inside the Vatican. The Vatican is behind this wall, but you see the waved roof. That's Nervi, the architect who also worked a lot in US. This is the audience hall in the Papal States, not Papal States, but now Vatican City State. He also built this Palazzetto dello Sport, the sports hall. There were the Olympics, don't forget, 1960. And then towards the end of the 20th century, there comes this movement called postmodern. So the architects were tired of these rationalist, simplified, minimalistic lines. So they go back to ornaments. And one of the rare, actually, examples of postmodern in Rome is the mosque, which was built in the 90s by the Italian architect Portoghesi. And it's far away from the center, but it's in Parioli. It's in the northern part of Rome, and it's extraordinary. It's huge. I just went there on a guided visit once, and these are old photos. Inside, on certain days of the week, they have guided tours, and it is beautiful. And now we are in the 21st century, all of a sudden, and I brought you to La Nuvola, the cloud. Fuchsas is an architect. He has this group that works for him, and this is now the convention and the art fair hall. This nuvola, this cloud, is enormous, and inside they organize the conventions and the booths for the art fairs. And from the outside, it looks like that. It's all this glass and then this huge, huge cloud inside. And more or less early, the first decade of the 21st century, Zaha Hadid designed Maxi. Unfortunately, she died way too soon. She designed this art gallery, which is a really interesting example of modern architecture. There's plenty of good modern architecture in Rome. And Richard Mayer designed the so-called Millennium Church in the faraway suburbs. And it is like the Holy Trinity. You see like three veils, and the Italian company called Italcementi, Italian cement, copyrighted this particular kind of cement that is not supposed to absorb the pollution. So he's got like exclusive right, and they have exclusive right to use of that kind. Those are like blocks, like Nervi, the other architect, remember the wavy roof, he designed and patented those blocks of armed cement. Then you'll use and put together and build new structures. And in this modern world, there's no more painted ceilings like in the church. This is a church, but you have this glass roof and you can see the actual sky instead of painting it. And Richard Mayer's Millennia Church was built in this not privileged suburb far away. And I just wanted to show you this contrast between this modern architecture and how people in practically quite marginalized neighborhoods live. We generally live in apartments. One-family homes are a rarity. Although, again, in faraway suburbs where there were actually the sheds for the migrants, maybe subsequent generations became a little wealthier. So of little shed, they built the little homes. So there are actually some one-family homes far in the suburbs, but it's not what we would call privileged living. But some of them can be cute. And the villini are very expensive now, the little villas. So I tried to cover a lot in 1 hour and 15. We promised that would be the length of the presentation. And let's just end up with my ubiquitous she-wolf. And if you would like to watch, well, you have my presentations on your site and also on olgarome.com, wherever you like. They're always free, and I'm always happy to share and come back to Carolyn and your center.
Wow. Thank you so much, Olga. That was, again, places I've never seen or thought to look at in Rome. That was fascinating. I don't see anything in the chat, but I think we were all hanging on each word that you spoke. But if anybody would like to, I can unmute you or you can write in the chat. So let's see. I'm going to give you the power to unmute yourself. Maria Chi said, many thanks to a wonderful conversation. And now if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, you can. Maria, did you have a question or a comment?
This was no, wonderful. Thank you. But now that you asked, I went to Rome in 1986, but I never saw many of the architectural buildings that you introduced today. So it's really an eye-opener. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm happy that you found it interesting, and it is off the beaten path, but yes, I'm glad with these new means that we're able to share that information as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Anybody else? You can unmute yourself. I think Maria Koss. Did you want to say something, Maria Koss?
I just thought this was wonderful. Thank you. And I hadn't planned to say anything, but I see you caught me unmuting.
Well, that's
Maria.
Thanks, Maria.
Yes, you're welcome.
I had a question, Olga. We talked about it a little bit, but what you know, some of these buildings are old, and you're saying they're very expensive, but I imagine plumbing and things like that are also old. I mean, you know, if somebody's shelling out $1 million for a building, are they also having to repair old systems?
It's all very tricky because the buildings that are former public housing, be it the kingdom without Mussolini or Mussolini, during his era, they could be very desirable because of the location, but they do tend to have problems with the sewer and a lot of like lack of maintenance. And you can have a lot of social context that may or not be desirable, because if somebody has remained poor and marginalized the family, then there could be little criminal aspects to it. You know, like there is famous Pineto that was so lovely, but then again, there was a lot of pushers showed up because the nightlife became intense and a lot of pushers showed up. That's not these fancy ones. So yes, you can have a lot of problems. You have to check very well, not just the sequence of owners, you know, from the government institution to public housing to the next generation, to who sold to whom, but also especially the plumbing and sewer and the roof and the isolation. Then a lot of these homes, they have the walls that seem sturdy, but since unless they were done for very high echelon employees, for example, the buildings of the railways, they seem like sturdy big buildings, but basically you can hear the neighbors through the walls. So they still do not regard most of these buildings as there are the categories in Rome. There's like a palatial, there's like just apartment, and then the popolare, edilizia popolare. So you really have to take a good look at the category if you're buying an apartment and make sure that it has the characteristics you want and it doesn't have lagging problems.
Mm-hmm.
The owner obviously will not tell you.
Yeah, I bet they wouldn't. Yeah. Maria Chi, yes.
Yes, I have a question, Olga. When you mentioned public housing, do you mean the same as what I understand here in the States, public housing in terms of projects like housing for low-cost housing for the underprivileged? Is that what you mean?
Okay, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
I think that in US you use the term project houses, or I'm trying to find what I found in the books and the translations, so I'm using public housing. But if there's a better word to use, I would be really happy to learn. So when I mention it, people would know what I'm talking about. Yes, underprivileged. I have a friend who just obtained a house, an apartment like that. He likes it very much. I mean, he's an honest working person. You know, he teaches at the school, but his income is very low because he's like a part-time, he's studying as well. And he managed to obtain this apartment in a good neighborhood for like 400 euro a month, which is nothing. You're paying at least 800-900 for a small place in that neighborhood. So yes, it's helping the underprivileged. And then there are people with no income, and then they would get it for maybe, there's always like a little rent but there's also a problem with people who are not paying it at all, and it's extremely difficult to kick them out, because where do you kick them out? You have another problem then. So you have to be careful when you go into these you have to just make sure, how is the neighborhood, how is the concept, are there people who are causing problems, and are there people who just have lived here nicely for generations? Maybe they can afford buying or not, but a lot of these people are afraid that these better neighborhoods, they became better. They were not better back then, but they became like better neighborhoods, that they will be put on auction, and that they will not be, they according to the law, they have they're first in line to buy them for a sort of privileged price after many years of paying low rent. But if they're kind of jumped over and the apartments are put on auction, it's a big problem socially.
So then the public housing, public apartment buildings in Rome, then they are also available for purchase then?
They are.
Because here, my understanding is that if it's like low cost housing, they're just apartments for rental to low income people, and there's nothing for sale. So it's different in Rome then.
Each building or complex could have a different situation. A lot of these that I showed you, like the railways, a lot of these people were allowed to buy from the government for a convenient price. And at that point, the next generation can sell to whomever they want. So it originally was public housing for the workers of the railways or anything else, but eventually the next generation has bought it from the government for a convenient price, and they can sell it for more or same or whatever they want. So in the same building, you can have the apartments that are still owned by the railways, and those who were sold, and now the heirs own it, and they can sell it to whomever they want. I just read recently in the papers, ATER, which is the new government association for the public housing or project homes. They announced the sale of a certain amount of apartments because they need funds. So you can buy from them, and then it was originally public housing, but now it's yours. They are also selling a lot of these apartments so they would get the funds for maintenance of other buildings that they're handling.
Understand. Thank you. It's different here than in what you just described. In that case, one last question.
Yes.
I also understand here, people who are like underprivileged or poor and need help, they can apply for government housing subsidy. I was told like Section 8. So the government subsidized their rental to rent housing. Is there such a thing in Rome then?
I don't know if it works like that, if it's called like that. I just know that these people are allowed to rent for lower price. So it basically comes to the same concept. But is it called like that or not? I wouldn't know the details of that. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
I appreciate Maria's question because, you know, the whole topic of gentrification and what that means and how that's affected the United States and cities. It's a really important topic. And the fact that people were displaced, but they maybe owned the house they were displaced from, and now they no longer own it. You know, generationally, that causes great problems with disparities amongst wealth, amongst different, you know, people. So thank you, Maria.
No, it's not easy for these people. I know, for example, I know two people, they're friends, I know them well, whose grandparents lived in the aqueducts because they came from either Calabria or Abruzzo, searching for work after the war. And these people, like, this is one of my friends, she got a degree, she works, she's a great successful young lady, but her grandparents lived in an aqueduct, and they were given a public housing place. But now with the higher education, her family was smart enough to invest, and she was a smart girl, obviously. She was worth investing into. So we could move away from that reality. Because our colleges are not expensive like in the US,
right?
In Europe in general.
Bruce, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to say something?
Yes. Mussolini seemed to build so many buildings and, of course, monuments to glorify him. How long was he in power?
21 years. He marches on Rome 1922. He becomes the president of the council. In 1943, he capitulated. He dragged Italy into too many disasters, and he's imprisoned in Abruzzo. German forces free Mussolini from prison, and they take him to the northern Italy, Lake Garda, where there was this puppet state called Republic of Salò, where he was the puppet of the Nazi regime as long as they lasted. And then in 1944, he tries to escape as the Allies are taking over. Italy switched sides between Axis and Allies. And he tries to escape with his mistress, Claretta Petacci. They're caught by the partisans on the Lake of Como, and the story goes Claretta jumped to protect Mussolini, and they were both shot. And then their bodies were taken, dead bodies were taken to Milan and hanged upside down in the Piazzale Loreto. So that was the sequence of events. But let's say 20, 21 years, when 43, he could be too late. And
Thank
one more
you.
year, more or less, in this puppet state in the north.
Thank you for this amazing presentation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Just another quick thank you from Clay. Olga, good to see you again. And to see the neighborhoods besides all the monuments and cathedrals and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Clay. Clay, thank you so much for coming back.
All right, well, thus ends another successful foray into Rome. This time, it's just a real treat always to see you, of course, but to, as Clay said, and other people, get another glimpse of this incredible city. And there's some incredible architecture you introduced us to, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, everyone at the center. And I hope to see you again, maybe when it gets colder.
That
And
would be,
darker.
that would be great. All right, everyone take care. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone.